Hello everyone and welcome. My name's Lisa Weston. I'm a midwife and I'm the president of the Association of Ontario Midwives. It's my pleasure to introduce midwives Marianne Leslie, Sarah Leslie, Claudette Leduc, and our lawyer Mary Cornish. Today, Ontario Midwives took a step to begin to right a long-standing societal wrong. About an hour ago, midwives filed a complaint before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. Simply put, we're suing the government under human rights legislation to protect pay equity for midwives, to ensure midwives are no longer subjected to a gender penalty. An independent expert has found that midwives earn 52% of what our work is worth. Midwives experience the perfect trifecta of discrimination. Midwives are primarily women, they are providing care to women, and they're providing care that is exclusively a woman's health experience. The fact that midwifery is about women providing care to women does not justify a gender penalty. Mary is going to present the details of our case, but before she does, we want you to hear directly from midwives, those of us who live with this gender penalty day in and day out. My work, Claudette's work, Marianne and Sarah's work is incredibly undervalued. All midwives suffer from stereotypes that infiltrate every aspect of our work, from relationships to physicians to what we're being paid. Historical prejudice abounds when it comes to midwifery, despite the fact that we shoulder a high level of responsibility for the women in our care. In Ontario, a healthy pregnant woman can choose a midwife or a physician because we provide equitable care. Midwives are expert in normal birth, and healthcare outcomes are exemplary for mother and baby under midwifery care. In the last 2 decades, midwives have helped 150,000 women in their labor. And today, we are asking that the labor of midwives be valued. Thanks. I'd like to ask Claudette to say a few words.
Merci, Lisa. Bonjour, je m'appelle Claudette Leduc, puis je suis sage-femme en Ontario depuis 10 ans. Aujourd'hui, l'Association des sages-femmes de l'Ontario a déposé une requête auprès du Tribunal des droits de la personne de l'Ontario en raison du refus du gouvernement de respecter l'équité salariale en ce qui concerne les sages-femmes ontariennes. L'équité salariale est un droit garanti par la loi. Cette protection est particulièrement nécessaire dans le cas des professions traditionnellement à prédominance féminine, lesquelles subissent une discrimination systémique et historique. Les sages-femmes sont un exemple particulièrement clair de cette discrimination historique, car la profession de sage-femme concerne les femmes, soigne les femmes, selon une démarche axée sur l'expérience des femmes. La pratique des sages-femmes est très estimée. Les sages-femmes dispensent des soins de très haute qualité et elles contribuent à l'optimisation des ressources du réseau de santé. Le gouvernement ne peut plus porter sourde oreille aux revendications des sages-femmes en matière d'équité salariale. Le non-respect de l'équité salariale est une pratique discriminatoire qui doit être corrigée. Les sages-femmes ont soutenu 150 000 femmes dans leur travail et leur accouchement. L'heure est venue. Le gouvernement doit respecter le travail des sages-femmes ontariennes à sa juste valeur et d'observer les principes d'équité salariale. Merci. Maintenant, j'aimerais demander à Sarah et Marianne de venir parler.
Merci, Claudette.
Pardon.
Good morning, everyone. I've been a midwife in Ontario for almost 28 years. I'm getting closer to the end of my career, and when I look back, I did not imagine that I would spend most of those years being paid inequitably. When we worked with women and government to regulate midwifery in Ontario 20 years ago, that was not our vision. It's not what I want for my daughter Sarah or for any of the other 700 midwives in Ontario who work with women day and night. Instead of valuing our work and our contributions to primary care reform, we've been subjected to a gender penalty. Thanks to pay equity law in Ontario, other female-dominated professions have received pay equity. Government has failed to complete a proper pay equity assessment for midwives, and as a result, the pay equity gap has increased year after year, and the government still refuses to address it. Pay equity, by law, is exempt from fiscal restraint. However, government has told midwives they don't have equity for us. They can't afford it. Equity is a right. It's a value Canadians hold dear. This is why we have laws that you can't discount someone's compensation simply because they work in a female-dominated sector. Today, according to the pay equity experts, my pay is only worth 52% of what it should be. That means that in July of each year, I start working for free. That's what a gender penalty means for me and for every other midwife in Ontario. Pay equity is the law and a basic human right. We've tried to work with government to close the pay equity gap. We've been patient. We didn't come to this decision lightly. We've done our part to support primary healthcare reform and to bring value to a healthcare system that is strapped. But it's not right that as women, frontline workers, we continue to subsidize healthcare by discounting our labor. We're speaking out because we're frustrated and we're angry, but also because we know there is a solution. The pay equity gap can be closed. I'm getting close to retirement, and I haven't been fairly compensated for my life's work, midwifery. I'm really angry about that, and I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm not willing to accept that the next generation, all of the midwives I've taught, all of the midwives I've mentored, my own daughter standing next to me, should continue to shoulder that burden of gender discrimination. And that's why this legal action is so important to me. I'll turn it over to Sarah now.
Thanks, Mom. Let me tell you why this legal action is so important to me. When I was a kid, my bedroom doubled as a clinic room when my mom was a midwife in the 1980s. Even as children, we knew she worked in the margins of the healthcare system. I have watched her work tirelessly over many years to succeed at making midwifery an option for all Ontario women. Babies aren't born on a schedule. To respond to the needs of clients, midwives are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This means I need childcare at unpredictable times and with little notice. It's expensive, it can be hard to access, and for many midwives, it means that our partners forgo paid work to take care of our children. As midwives, we must be available to women when they go into labor, and our compensation must reflect the burden of our unpredictable schedules and our long hours. The neglect and devaluing of midwives and of women's health has continued literally for generations. It's not fair to my mom. It's not fair to me. It isn't fair to anyone. When one of us faces discrimination, everyone lives with discrimination. To devalue midwifery services is to devalue women. Government has said that they value midwifery, that they invest in midwifery. They invest in midwifery infrastructure, but not in midwives, not in my labor as a frontline healthcare provider. I'd like to ask our lawyer, Mary Cornish, to talk about the case.
Thank you. As has been said, we filed this morning and served on the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care an application to the Human Rights Tribunal alleging that this midwifery lack of equitable compensation is a violation of the Human Rights Code. Our application outlines the many ways in which the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care has systematically set a compensation fee structure for midwives for nearly 20 years, which is discriminatory. In other words, it created a gender penalty discount, and the midwives, as you have heard, are suffering from it. This inequitable compensation robs midwives of their human rights, and it is clear that we need to understand this is a fundamental human right. Pay equity is protected by the Pay Equity Act, but it is also protected by the Human Rights Code. It is also protected by international standards, which say that these midwives are entitled to pay equity. The responsibility for setting compensation, which has rested with the Ministry of Health and with others who set compensation, means that they need to have a process in place to ensure that women's work is valued on the basis of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions comparably to appropriate male work. It doesn't always have to be the same, but it has to be comparably valued. Midwifery is the most exclusively female-dominated profession in Ontario. Midwifery actually means with women. In other words, as has been said, it's work by women, for women, and it relates to women's health. And it's the combination of these factors that has actually contributed to the systemic discrimination and discounting of these midwives' pay. The healthcare system itself is sex stratified. The professions that comprise it are sex stratified. Although more and more women have steadily joined the physicians' ranks, the profession of physician still remains male-dominated, and its compensation has benefited from that history of being male-dominated. So how did the gap that we're talking about here today, and that you can see in this chart, how did it occur? Well, first of all, the ministry froze the compensation of midwives for a period of 11 years, from 1994 to 2005, and another 3-year period from 2011 to today. During that period of time, the community health center's salaried physicians, which was the midwifery male comparator, at the time their compensation was set by the ministry back in 1994, they received compensation increases of 76%. Since that date, when it was first set, the compensation, the ministry has taken no proactive steps in order to ensure that the work of midwives remained and continued to be pay equity compliant. On the contrary, as the skills and demands and contributions of midwifery work increased over the years, the compensation of the comparator increased while the midwives' work and pay were frozen. And without this pay equity monitoring, it was the ministry itself which created the gap that you can see. And as the midwives increasingly complained about this gap, the ministry said, it's too big a gap, it's too expensive to close. We can't close that pay gap. When it says that the Ontario government is violating the Human Rights Code, and that's what we will be seeking to prove at the Human Rights Tribunal, they are obligated to fix this problem, and the Human Rights Tribunal has the powers to do it. Pay equity is a right for all women's work, and it's a right that has to be enforced. Before the tribunal, the midwives will be asking the tribunal to order that the ongoing compensation of midwives is set fairly. And it's set in a pay equity process that ensures there's an equitable bargaining structure, that ensures there are regular pay equity evaluations, and that the implementation of that would be monitored by an independent third party. Midwives will also be seeking compensation for injury to dignities, feelings, and self-respect. This is a power that the Human Rights Tribunal has, and it is an important one, as you have heard today, in relation to ensuring that the fundamental human rights of midwives are respected. I've worked on a lot of cases with respect to pay equity, and I've never seen a case as dramatic as this in terms of this gap. The gender penalty here is absurd. As the midwives have said, experts here have determined that the midwives are earning only half of what they should be earning, which is how, as has been said, by July of any particular year, they start to work for free. It is time for equity. It's time for accountability. It's time for the Human Rights Tribunal to work through its processes, and we will be asking them to make the necessary orders to ensure that midwifery has equitable compensation. The panel and I would now be happy to take any questions that you may have.
I understand that midwives in Ontario have been trying to close this gap for years with with no effect. Is going to the Human Rights Tribunal kind of a last-ditch, desperate attempt to try to get the government to close this gap?
Well, certainly it's the legal remedy that the midwives have, and they've been involved in discussions with the governments for years, in which they finally said to the government that if they don't take any appropriate steps, they're going to have to take this legal remedy.
Why has it taken 20 years to get to this
Sorry, I can't
point?
hear you.
Why has it taken 20 years to get to this point, take this action? That's quite a long time for midwives to be.
Midwives have been fairly patient, actually. And over the years, they have kept asking and asking and asking over a period of time. And I think you might want to touch that.
I think as midwives, we love our work, and we've been busy doing our work. But we have also worked hard at addressing all of the avenues that were open to us with government over decades. I sat on our board for a number of periods since the 1990s. This has been an ongoing theme, and we have just been ignored.
How much would it cost if you win this? What would it cost the healthcare system?
That would be something that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal would communicate to the Ministry of Health, and the ministry would need to calculate that.
The ministry says consistently that there's no more money to go into the system. So what aspect of the healthcare system would this be taken from?
Pay equity is a basic obligation of the healthcare system for everybody within the professions in the system. It is a matter of something that has to be paid for. It is the first thing, really, that needs to be paid for. So we don't feel it's a matter of taking it from somewhere else. It's a matter of paying the women equitably. It's the law, and it has to be complied with.
Where would the money come from, then, if it's not going to be taken from someplace else, if they say there's no more money in the pay envelopes?
Well, as you will see, if maybe you read if you review things, the government has actually given money out to a whole series of male-dominated professions, and including the OPP, a series of people who have actually gotten money. The government has made its choices. It chose not to provide the midwives with an equitable compensation, and it now has to pay for that.
Are there any precedents you'll be focusing on in this case, especially to do with healthcare workers and pay equity?
Well, there are pay equity cases that have dealt with the undervaluation of nursing work. There's pay equity cases that have dealt with other kinds of healthcare professionals, and we're relying on a variety of those kinds of precedents about the fact that healthcare work has been traditionally dominated by women, although the male-dominated professions are at the top of the hierarchy.
The government will probably tell you that the principle of equity does not apply to independent contractors such as midwives. What are you answering to that?
Sorry. The government said they don't think it applies?
They will probably tell you that you're not covered by the principle of pay equity, such as independent contractors.
The Human Rights Code has clear precedents that say that the right to equal treatment in employment covers independent contractors, and we are filing the complaint under the Human Rights Code.
Would you want a retroactive compensation if the tribunal rules in your favor?
Sorry,
retroactive.
Voulez-vous que je réponde en français?
Oui, peut-être après, mais on va laisser.
Sure, I can. Yes, the claim is asking for retroactive compensation. It's up to the tribunal to determine in what manner it would do that. We're also asking for future remedies. In other words, we're asking them to ensure that there's an equitable bargaining structure, that there's a process in place so that as the skills and demands of midwifery change, that it will be compensated for.
So how much money would that represent?
It isn't clear at this point because we don't have all the data as to what it would cost, but it would be a significant portion of money.
But you would want money.
And in that respect, what I think it's important to recognize is that the government has a proactive pay equity law that requires people to, as they go along, evaluate work. So the government had a responsibility starting in 1994 to do that and to set aside the necessary money to pay for it. So at this point, and this has been found in various cases, it isn't sufficient to come back and say, I'm sorry, we didn't carry out our obligation and we didn't save the money that's needed to pay you equitably.
Do you know if any other groups attempted this and succeeded to get?
Well, there are all kinds of pay equity cases that have succeeded. For example, the federal government the government resisted paying its federal employees compensation for almost 30 years and ended up having to pay very substantial sums of money out. And when it comes to the time to paying it, it's not sufficient for the government to say, I'm sorry, we didn't save the money.
You're using the Paul Derber report, building this argument. Are there any other reports that suggest that midwives should be paid more?
There are reports that, there was two reports in 2003, 2004 by Hay Compensation, and there was another report in 2010 which the government commissioned, which also suggested there were substantial pay equity gaps, which the government ignored.
Okay.
Who commissioned Mr. Derber's report?
Sorry?
Who commissioned the Derber report?
The Derber report was commissioned by the association.
Is this at all related to the fight over a contract? Like, would it I know there's like the midwives are operating without a contract. So if the government came to the table and put forward a contract that was a fair deal, would you guys withdraw this challenge, or are they two separate issues?
They're two separate issues. In fact, we did come to agree to a contract with the ministry that after they clearly stated that they would not be addressing the pay equity issue. And so what we did then is split it out. So we dealt with the contract issues and we informed them then that we would be going forward with a human rights complaint.
When did you guys strike a contract?
It was offered in April and we ratified it in May.
How does pay for Ontario midwives compare to midwives in other provinces?
You'd have to contact the Canadian Association of Midwives to get that kind of information, but one of the things we do know in Ontario pay equity legislation, comparing across jurisdictions is not appropriate, because a female-dominated profession that's not being compensated appropriately in one province is likely not going to be compensated appropriately in other provinces as well.
What kind of compensation are you seeking for emotional turmoil?
What kind of what?
A compensation for dignity.
Well, that will depend on what the evidence is at the hearing, but they're in terms of what amount would be given out, but the tribunal regularly gives compensation in this respect.
So you don't have any idea?
No.
And what's the timeline we're looking at here? What's the timeline?
The timeline, the ministry has about a month and a half to file its response. Then the association would file a reply, and at that point the Human Rights Tribunal would set the matter down for hearing. It would likely be next fall.
You're using family doctors as your comparable salary. A lot of people would say physicians go to school for a lot longer period of time than midwives. Why use doctors?
So first of all, it was actually the government that originally used the family physician in the community health center as the comparator. So that's the first thing to start off with. They used that as a comparator back in 1993 and determined that the midwives should be paid less than the that family physician, but still in a reasonable proportion to them. The Derber report, which has resulted in this gap, actually has done a detailed analysis of the skills, effort, and responsibility and working conditions of the family physician on a variety of the various factors that are involved in a gender equitable plan. As a result of which, Mr. Derber came up with the analysis that the work of the midwives was 91% of the work of the family physician in this community health center. So it's a specific analysis to the family physician in this community health center. And the ministry itself sets the compensation directly of this physician on a salary basis.